here is Abel, who is coming into Lagos from Asaba. His brother has just disappeared, and he's coming to meet the wife, and she's picked him up from the bus park. So I'm going to read just a very tiny bit, and I will go to another part and read again. What are the police saying? They say they are investigating. Abel thought she heard her voice break. I haven't given them any money in the past few days, and I think they are slacking. What did they do when they were not slacking? He asked, without meaning to. Don't mind me, I tend to voice out my thoughts. You also tend to write them down, she said, looking at him. Ada, you look more beautiful when you're angry. He laughed and tried to change the topic, but she kept staring at him with a face that mirrored her rage. We have had this conversation before, he said finally. Yes, and were interrupted when Sonny walked in. You think every girl you meet in a club is a prostitute. I never said that, but you implied it. My parents are both lecturers like you, PhD holders. My two siblings are medical doctors. You don't know me, she said with feeling. I agree, and I am sorry, Abel said. That letter was meant for my brother. So a few days later, he's gone to visit an elderly woman who used to sleep with his brother. Yeah.
I don't think she was sleeping with him. They were doing other things.
Okay, I mean, there wasn't much sleeping, yeah, but. So, the woman lives in Parkview, which is a highbrow area in Lagos. So the woman welcomed them in a flowing gown reminiscent of Stevie Nicks of Fleetwood Mac. Abel could see that she wasn't wearing any panties as she stood in the doorway, waving them in. You are Abel, Abi? She asked, as she settled at the head of an expansive dining table with 12 chairs. Yes, Abel replied, intimidated by the grandeur. Though not nearly as grand as Sonny's house, the woman's house still spoke of affluence and wealth. Your brother thought you were the salt of the earth. Are you 10 inches? Abel shook his head. I have never measured it, he said with a smile. You don't have to. It doesn't help anyone. I told Sonny he was nothing without his dick. I made a big mistake. I told my friends about him, 9 inches and all. They rushed after him and he thought he had arrived. They were all married. I was the widow. I honored my husband for 7 years before I met Sonny. He was smart, funny, good looking, fun to have around, and very ambitious. She suddenly turned to look at Santos. Hey, who's this smiling monkey? My cousin, Abel said. Tell him to wait outside, the woman said, as if Santos was not there. Abel waved at Santos to leave. Are you married? She asked. Abel shook his head. Are you fucking his wife? Of course not, Abel shouted, and she laughed. She's a lovely girl. So did you mean of course not, or not yet? Abel had no answer, so she said, let's eat. And they did. Thank you.
All right.
Is about the weather forecasting for D-Day in World War II. And the story is the bit I'm going to read, or that again Zukiswa has asked me to read, forced me to read, involves a young man called Henry Meadows who works for the Meteorological Office, and he's been sent on a secret mission up to Scotland to try and get an equation really out of a professor, a famous professor of maths, who is a pacifist and won't get involved in the war, but he has the secret to modern weather forecasting, really, which is how turbulence or the wind and temperature move the weather from one area to another. And so the young man's just arriving at the professor's house. Hearing a sound, I turned to see a tall woman emerge from an outhouse behind me. Her blonde hair was scraped under a scarf, and she wore a woolen jumper, corduroy trousers, and Wellington boots. She was carrying an empty hand seed sower an instrument that allowed one to control the flow of seeds through different outlets. There was something about her that was immediately reassuring. She gave a start when she saw me, then smiled. "I'm supposed to be propagating cabbages," she said, lifting up the sower's funnel-shaped spout and peering at me mischievously through it. She held out a hand. "But I've lost the packet that the seeds are in. Jill Ryman, and you must be?" "Henry Meadows. I'm from the Met Office. I'm staffing the radio equipment in Mr. McKellar's field." Jill Ryman, eyes the colour of the sea and just as changeable but brighter, lines of care on her brow, and yes, she looked tired, but she was intriguing as well as reassuring, most of all those eyes which were filled with the fierce energy of true believers. I didn't know then quite how unquenchable was the faith of this bright-eyed huntress of seed, whom I would so terribly harm. It was her faith that saved me, not my own, and it was her intelligence which cracked the number. But on first meeting her, I got no sense of either of these things. She was, instead, the object of misdirected, melancholic longings, feelings that I only half understood myself. Her hand was cold and slightly calloused as I shook it. I noticed there was scroll work on the front of her jersey. She was attractive, quite a big woman overall, but also, in an odd way, angular. The mixture gave a sense of strength and frailty in balance, as if she were both fern and flower. It made you wonder what lay beneath. "Oh, that's you, is it?" She took off the scarf, shook out her locks, then looked me up and down like a farmer inspecting a bullock at market. We noticed the men from the ministry had been busy. "My husband once worked for the Met Office." "Well, that's why I'm here," I said. "I mean, at your door. I'm a follower of his weather work." "Really? But he gave all that up ages ago. He concentrates on his peace studies now." Peace studies. How strange that sounded in wartime. A blasphemy. For a moment I was lost for anything to say. I didn't want to arouse suspicion. "All the same," I said eventually, "I'm very interested in his mathematics. I can't promise he'll see you, but do come in." I stepped through the front door again. "Oh, we don't use that one," she said. "This way." I followed her round to the back. I found myself gazing at her well-covered form. She had a roundness across the hips. Otherwise she was bony, all knees and elbows and shoulders. Behind the house, stretching up a hillside towards a low stone building and McKellar's field, were vegetable gardens, in which I noticed a labourer digging. "That's a cot house up there," she said, gesturing at the old stone building as she opened the back door. Cot house. McKellar had used the same odd term, which I later learned was just an old word for a dwelling on agricultural land. The little black Highland cattle I'd seen earlier had moved closer to the stone enclosure. Now they were gathering round it, angling down their malevolent-looking horns as if they might lift it from its ancient foundations. "Those are our gardens in between." My gaze drew back down nearer to the old man digging. "Parsnips," added Mrs. Ryman by way of explanation as I followed her into the hall. Directly, something hit me on the head. "Sorry, should have warned you. That's my husband's special heating system. It hangs from cables. Don't ask me how it worked." A series of pipes supported by wires ran down the centre of the hallway. The whole place smelled strongly of steam and chemicals. I followed her through into a large country kitchen. "Cup of tea?" "Yes, please." The kitchen was rather Spartan. "Excuse me, but is your husband here?" I said. "He's always here," she said. "That was him digging in the garden." "That was Professor Ryman." I was amazed.
Hi, thank you all for being here. So my novel is Radiance of Tomorrow, and just a brief background. It is looking at what happens after wars end and people decide to return to the places that they'd lived and try to re-embrace the traditions that they had before. Is that possible? If not, what do they do with themselves? So in this book, you have characters such as grandmothers, grandfathers returning, former child soldiers who had hurt people in their communities returning, a young woman who was pregnant returning with a child she had had from being raped, and all of these things. So the part that I will read a little bit talks about this new environment where there was now a mining company bringing different difficulties for the people. But before I go forward, I just say that as I was sitting here, hearing everybody read, I couldn't help to think that there's fella right there looking at me and smiling a little, you know. Anyway, that's just a side note, but I just couldn't help it, and I was smiling. But this book starts in the beginning. The first lines in this book I'll read because I think it's kind of crucial and telling in the way I thought of phrasing this book. And it starts, "It is the end, or maybe the beginning of another story. Every story begins and ends with a woman, a mother, a grandmother, a girl, a child. Every story is a birth." That's how the novel begins. But now I will read the area that I want, and it's very short. "One weekend, a group of men, 2 foreigners and 2 locals, forcibly took a young woman who was returning from the river carrying a bucket of water. They slowed down their vehicle and offered her a ride into town. She refused, so they grabbed her, threw her in the back, and drove her up the hill to their quarters. Her name was Yinka, and she was not from Imperi, but she could have been anyone's daughter. The next morning, she was found on the side of the road by the bar, her pelvis broken. Unable to stand, she had dragged herself toward her house but could not get that far. The women came with clothes and covered her bloody and naked body. They carried her home and tended to her, but she didn't want to be in this world any longer. No one knew where she was from, and no one came to claim her body. She was buried, and people cried for her because she was someone's daughter, and this could have happened to any other young girl or woman in town. The police did nothing, even when people went to the station to give the names of the 4 men. We know who they are, and you do nothing about it. This means you encourage them to do more of such things." A neighbor of Yinka's shouted from among the people who had come to the station to demand an investigation. The police threw tear gas into the crowd. This town, where not so long ago, even after the war, one allowed one's daughter to play under the moonlight and with other children, where even though things weren't as close to perfect, a mother and father didn't stand barefoot in a pot of hot oil each time their daughter left the house to fetch a bucket of water. This town, what was it now, and what would become of its people? Soon, there were rapes that no one spoke of, not only because the women were ashamed, but also because the families felt helpless, and the only dignity left was silence. Sometimes, the growing belly of a young girl shattered that falsehood, and the child she gave birth to had the color off and resembled one of the workers, white or black. Nothing was said about such things. The children became part of Imperi's forgotten population. For the moment, there was some laughter coming through the wind. So life still lived here after all.
Yes, in all 3 of your novels, I was thinking to myself that Lola decided to call this panel Men Writing Women, despite the fact that really some of the main characters in your books are really are men, but they, the women are actually anchoring the characters, and I want us to discuss about that. Toni, I would like to start with you, and perhaps the passage that you read, women and sexuality. In a lot of ways, the women that Abel meets, at the end of the day, they are the ones who decide on what happens, and I'd like to discuss it in context really with this festival, with the F word and sexuality and violence and power, you know.
I'm not sure I understand the question, but let me just take a stab. So I had a reading with Lola about 4 years ago at Terra Culture in Lagos, and after we read from my other book, so there were questions. It was a Valentine's Day, reading, and a young lady who is a Muslim said something very profound. I thought was very profound. She said that the moment a man comes to a woman and says hi, she has already decided whether she's going to sleep with him or not. That's, I mean, whatever happens afterwards is just bullshit, it's just a dance. And so you find it also in this book. I think in a way, the women know what they want, but they just want you to like, do what you want to do. Ada meets Sonny in the club, and she knows who he is, what he does, but she goes with him. This old woman meets Sonny in a shop, and decides, that this is the man she wants to end her 7-year sexual exile with, and then she meets Abel meets his old girlfriend, and so it's all about connections, right? And people will say, why do they always have to have sex or whatever, and my answer is always that when you're writing about people who are young, sex will come up in the question at some point. So the women provide an anchor, yes, and the stories revolve around them in certain ways. Because I don't know about other men, but I think that for most of the men I know, no matter how much money or success you achieve, it's nothing if there's no woman to share it with. It feels as if the women, give certain kind of grounding to whatever you've achieved. A friend of mine said, if you bought a G-Wagon, for instance, you will tell your very good friends, oh, I just bought this car. But your wife can call her friend and say, oh, come and see our new car. And it doesn't feel like she's boasting. But if a guy did it, it would be like, so I think we in a way, men go to war, go to battle, go to hustle, and just lay everything at the altar of a woman. And I think that's what comes across here. What somebody said to me was that, did I realize while writing this book that if Sonny is declared dead, that Abel will be, to use his words, that Abel will be fucked up because he will lose everything, basically.
Yeah.
So.
Ishmael, on power and really, in context with all these young women in the book who come in, because the old lady is the first person who gets into this village, and she, and indeed, in fact, when she goes between her and the chief, who's also a woman, they are the two sides. And I have to say, your book was very deceptive because it's called Radiance of Tomorrow, but there's the radiance at the beginning, and then afterwards I kept saying, okay, when is it coming? When is it coming? When is it coming? And then it's like, the mining company comes in and things keep going, and I'm like, oh, come on, So, but it was beautiful, and it was very much the reality of mining companies in a lot of African countries and mining communities. But I wanted to talk about this violence that's meted on a people that have already been violated. When you just think, wow, hope is about to come. And I had earlier asked you to read about Colonel, but you didn't read it. But this is a reason for all of you to buy the book. You will need to read this Colonel incident. It's just absolutely it's brutal, but it's also really like I couldn't help but kind of like cheer for him, yes. Because of the violence that's meted on women in this village by these 4 men at the mining company. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yes. Well, first of all, I think the book, when it opens up with an older lady that I envisioned to be, imagine my grandmother returning, and partly because I feel that when a connection has been broken to the land, it's the elders who come first to rekindle the friendship with the spirits again. So she comes and begins to clean the bones, and then other people come. But also what I wanted to do, even though there are men that are narrating the book, but the background and the anchor is women, because I think as men, we have this illusion of control over women, which is not true. So I wanted the book to show that as well. We always think we're in control, but we are actually not in control of women at all. And any man who tries to control a woman, you know that eventually the woman will figure out and will leave you, probably. So that never works. But what happens in this narrative is that in this new environment that all these characters had returned, there's a lot of injustice going on. And there are people who are coming from the war, from various aspects of the war, who do not want to feel worthless about their lives anymore. They've learned certain skill set that they don't want to be violent, but they knew they needed to protect their community. And one of them is a young former child soldier called Colonel. And he has put together a family of young girls and young boys together because they've lost their mothers and fathers. And one of his sisters was attacked by one of these four guys and raped. And so he decided to take matters in his own hands because the police were not doing anything. And basically, because he was a former military guy, attacked the men, tie them up and, yeah, buy the book. That's the rest of the story. It's a cliffhanger. But basically, the idea is that, often in somehow when violence is exerted on a community, women are always the one that are used as a way to dismantle the functionality of a community, of a society, women and then children, or children and then women, but there's always women involved to some extent. So I wanted to show how this was happening, but at the same time how the expectations of the elders were forcing a new idea to come about, how people wanted to live, what they wanted to embrace, even though it was difficult in the face of all these new things that were coming. At the same time, with all of this backdrop, people have to live. They have to learn to live, and I think that's what is very crucial in the way that I write, is that just because there are difficulties doesn't mean that life stops. Even in the midst of war, life continues. People fall in love, they try to keep their families together, they try to laugh, they try to have fun. The human condition does not cease to exist because there's difficulties. So often when it's presented particularly from the media point of view, it's like, oh, the Africans running from war constantly. First of all, during war, nobody has the money to buy bullets to shoot for 24 hours for 10 years. It's not possible. So the wars stop, and then people continue their lives again, even in the midst of it. So I also wanted to show that strength, that resilience, that innovation that comes about. I've been in certain contexts in war zones where I was in Central African Republic where I do some work for the UN to negotiate the release of children from armed groups. And as we're talking to these warlords, with guys with heavy weapons around, I noticed something. Maybe because I'm a writer, I pay attention to details that other people don't see, and I'm very distracted. There's a little boy standing, and he had made a Walkman out of clay, and he had a little thing in his ears that are made of clay, like earbuds, and he was just standing there going like this. And I'm thinking to myself, what kind of music is he listening to, So I'm trying not to be distracted because I'm talking to the warlord, but at the same time, I'm more taken by. So people find a way to live. So I also wanted to show that. Yeah.
Giles, I think I wanted to come at you on women and intellect, because one of the things that your main character does is he underrates Jill. And when he meets her, he doesn't realize just how intelligent she is. And in the end, she's the one who helps him. But prior to that, even when he doesn't realize that she's been paying attention to certain things, and she's the one who does, who gets his blood and tries to find ways. And do you perhaps find that this happens quite a bit, where women may either downplay their intellect to get a certain way, or just maybe the men in their lives may decide, they're not that intelligent, up until later on they get surprised, like, oh wow, she's really sharp.
Well, he does definitely. So the narrator of the book does definitely underrate this woman with whom he's about to have an affair, and he then spends months and months trying to do some mathematics. It's more interesting than it sounds, I promise. In terms, but it's only when she explains to him how to do this particular type of maths that he solves the problem on the very close to D-Day. But I think male characters in novels do constantly misread women, and in a sense that provides some of the dramas of that kind of novel. I don't know whether this is, and also obviously women constantly being, as it were, sort of misrepresented in novels. I have a theory that probably this is sort of embedded in the genre in a way. If you look back at the beginnings of the novel in Britain, at least, there are two forms. There's Robinson Crusoe adventure novel, and then novels like Clarissa and Pamela, which are novels of either seduction or rape in Clarissa's case. So I think the novel itself is kind of tied up with these questions of relationships between genders, but also somehow it's always trying to run away from its own form. So I don't think that my book's very unusual in having a female character who at first seems only like an object of desire, and then surprises some of the other characters. In a way, probably she surprised me as a writer too. That's something that happens when characters come to life, if you're able to make that happen.
Toni. Yes. So, what I really absolutely enjoyed about Carnival City is a tour, the way you gave us a tour of Lagos. I'd like you to talk about that, your relationship with the city, because that comes out so clearly. So the place of creation, the place that you used, your setting, I'd like us to talk about that.
The novel, in a sense, took like 15 years to write. Not because I was slow, but because I couldn't really figure out how to write a story about Lagos that wouldn't be about the island or the mainland without them meeting. Because if you read Lagos books, it's either somebody's talking about Ikoyi and VI, or about Adegule and stuff. So I had to find a way, to have somebody who would know both of them very well. And it was a moment of clarity. One evening, I was having a drink with a Kenyan journalist, and some boys walked in, of course, Yahoo boys, fraudsters, young fraudsters, whatever, how would I describe it now? Okay, so they walk into the bar. Obviously, they shouldn't be there, but they made some money, so they are there, and they start talking. And one of them had just rented an apartment in Ikoyi, so which meant they could now run away from the mainland and come to the island and chill. And it just hit me that whoever had to tell the story of Lagos would have lived on both sides of the city. Now, for those who are not from Nigeria, the island is cut off from the mainland by a bridge, and some people on the island only come to the mainland on their way to the airport. They don't ever come to the mainland, And there are people who live on the mainland who go every day across that bridge to the island, but have never been in a house on the island. So they go to their offices, go to the shops, but they don't know how people on the island live. And this is just one city, and the dichotomy is clear. So I had to find a way to do that. So I found a guy who had made money on the mainland as a thief, and then now gone to live on the island as a big boy. So in Lagos, there's actually people who are called Lagos big boys. So they don't have a job, but they have money. And they don't have a business, actually. So they just, there are people who go to bed with $1 and wake up with $2 million, and nobody asks any questions. And what happens first is a change of name. There's no going to the court. It's just you become something you're not. You just change your name. It happens all the time. And then when you lose the money, you also change your name, to reflect your new poverty. So in writing that book, I wanted to so that was the first part. But second part was I wanted to write a story that you could come to Lagos and you could take this book and walk through Lagos and you could actually navigate your way. So I gave very detailed descriptions of places. And my publishers were like, no, it was too much. I didn't even think that people would like it, but people seemed to like it. So I wanted to draw like a map of Lagos in words, and so people could just. Actually, a friend of mine took the book and was trying to locate Ayo Morocco's house. Ayo de Morocco, the lady with the blonde hair. She's somewhere here. Because her street is it's in the book. So he drove from Ikoyi, and then he says, "Guy, I can't find the house." I'm like, well, I don't want to put her in danger, but so that worked on that scale, and I just thought it's something that in 20 years time, you can pick up this book and and they're like this place used to be here, but no longer here, and that's what I thought. I was trying to do, and thankfully it worked out.
Fun. Ishmael, I'm going to talk to you about place as well. This village that people have come back to is their hometown, and then it becomes, minerals are discovered, and I couldn't help because I had just watched a documentary called Strike a Rock about the women of Marikana, which, as you might know, was the place where miners got shot by police in South Africa, in a democratic South Africa, protecting the interests of like the mining companies, and I wanted, you dwell quite richly on the devastation that's caused on the land, but also, the actions of the mining company. Do you think that this is something that I realize the familiarity, but do you think this is something that, as a people, perhaps as a continent, we can actually go away and be able to have the interests of the human beings that actually stay in those mining towns, because they all have these contracts where they're supposed to do certain things, but they don't actually do. How does that get enforced? Do you have an idea?
Well, for the novel, the idea was, after these characters return to this town in Imperi, they don't only have to learn to embrace their traditions again, if possible, they also have to find a way to sustain themselves, to live. So they did a little bit of farming, but they wanted to sort employment. Some people became teachers, but the only viable employment company around was a mining company. And so whether they liked it or not, somehow they had to work for this company, whether they liked it or not. Some people resisted, but eventually found themselves, even teachers, leaving because the government is not paying them. So they go to work for this mining company. But there's some line I wanted to draw based on an experience that I've had, and imagination as well, is that as Sierra Leoneans, and maybe I'll generalize as Africans, land means more to us than just the physical aspect of it. There's a spiritual connection to it. There are graveyards where grandparents and people like that are buried, where you can trace your history. So this mining company, the way it was mining the minerals was to flood the area with dams. And so they would actually destroy the physical structure of the land. The war tormented the people, but they knew they could always come back. There was a physicality there, but the mining company was now taking away that possibility. So there was already a psychological damage. But the other thing is that, I think in my country, in Sierra Leone, the law that governs ownership of land, it's very complicated and stupid. I was trying to find a better word, but it's very stupid. For example, in Sierra Leone, it says that there's something that's called surface rent. It says that the citizens own the surface part of the land. So the villagers own the surface, but the government owns what's under the land. So how is that even possible? How do you demarcate, where? So basically, the government can give contract to anybody to come and find what's under the land while you own the surface. So they can destroy this. So basically, the government gives these contracts to these mining companies with really bad human rights records, and they just go and literally they start using bulldozers to unearth graveyards and throw the bodies out. So this is what I was fictionalized in this. And we also had incidents in Sierra Leone in the diamond area where they do this blasting to blast certain rocks they can get to the diamond. And every day there are people who live next door to that town that basically become refugees every day, because when the blasting happens, they have to leave. If you stay, you will die because the stones will come flying and kill you. So every morning they have to pack up their families and run away. And only the siren comes on to tell them we're about to blast, which could be a minute or 2 minutes. So old people, everybody has to run. Now when they complain to the government sent the police with live bullets to shoot at them. And we had incidents like this in Sierra Leone where that happens. So then you begin to wonder, okay, should we blame the foreigners coming? Or should we blame our own leaders who are giving access to people to do these kinds of stuff to us? Yes, we have minerals, we want people to take them and we want to use that revenue, but should it be at our own demise? Should it be at destroying our culture? So these questions I did not I try to answer in the novel, so you can read it and see whether I did or not.
Right. Giles, you, I was particularly interested in how Henry just remembers the Malawi and keeps going back to the Malawi of his childhood where he had left when he was 15. I wanted to talk about that because you told me you stayed in Malawi as well as a child. And so was that like autobiographical?
Yes, I suppose in terms of the story, and this was my first novel that's not primarily set in an African country, but I wanted to keep a sort of connection to other things I'd written. So that was partly the reason for having this character with a pre-war colonial childhood. But in other ways, I also wanted to show that this conflict that was happening in mainland Europe was. I wanted to suggest that it was also happening in different parts of the world, other parts of the world, including in parts of Africa. But and yes, you're right. In a way, there's a slight suggestion of some autobiographical elements there. Although I was in Malawi in the 1970s, not the 1930s, but or 20s. So a dog. Yes, yeah. That dog is part. That dog is just quite. That's in the book. Is yeah. That's pretty much autobiographical. But I'm allowed to put my dog in my book, surely. Yeah. So, and the other thing that happens as we're, on this subject of men. Well, I don't want to spoil the book, but let's just say that this character is less of a man at the end of the book than he is at the beginning. I'm not going to say any more, but...
Absolutely. All right, I would, at this point, like to invite anybody who has a question. Any questions? Since you brought the issue of manhood, Ishmael, I'm going to ask you about the fluid masculinities in particular, and we talked about this yesterday, we chatted about it, on how your in your book, it's that there's women, and so it's not always like men who come to the rescue. There are these women, including the little child who tells wonderful stories.
But absolutely, because one of the things that, in all the characters that are there, the reason why they're able to function and even deal with the realities they're faced with is because of these women in their lives, whether it's their wives or their children, girls, who have a different point of view and a different ways of looking at the situation that grounds them. And the story starts with a woman coming to the land, and it ends with a little girl who has been given the task of carrying the story. And in my particular tribe in Sierra Leone, the women are the ones who carry the stories for us. And so as they get older, they pass it on to girls, which is why I started the book with an older woman, and it ends with a little girl who actually takes care of a family emotionally without knowing. And as all of us can attest to this, as a man in an African country, you realize that the women support the homes in ways we can't, men are not incapable of doing, emotionally, physically, or in any other way. So I also wanted to attest to that. And additionally, there's a little bit of autobiography to it because, I grew up with my grandmother. Though she didn't receive formal education, as she didn't go to school, but she's one of the most intelligent people I know in my life. Exceptional in all kinds of ways. She's been through all sorts of things. And so I also wanted to pay homage to her in the narrative to show that where I got even my narrative sense and arc from before I even learned how to write was from my grandmother, because she always tell me a story about everything. If I ask our grandmother, I just fell off the mango tree and I hurt my foot, she would say, I have a story about a guy who fell off the mango tree. I would need some attention, but okay, let's hear the story. So as a kid growing up, it was always something. So I wanted to also pay homage to her by having that strong feminine quality, I travel around, I lived outside on the African continent for a while, and people speak about African women as weak. And I always say to them, I don't know what African women you know, but the ones that I've met are nowhere near weak at all. So I also wanted to show that in the narrative.
Right. Any question?
Sorry, I have just a very simple question for the three of you. I just want to know, since you are men writing about women, have you ever, while writing or researching, do you actually speak to women to find out if, for example, if or your character is on a period and you're trying to write about, have you ever actually called maybe your friend or your wife or just sat a woman down like, oh, so how does this feel and all that? Because I believe if you're writing medical, anything, the chat I had this morning with the lady that wrote about sickle cell, she said she spoke with her mom to get more details like the drug. So I just want to know if you've actually done that. Thank you.
Well, I certainly have, and much often to the great amusement and ridicule from my female friends when I show them things of that nature. They usually say, "This is completely wrong. You're an idiot," and so on. So that happens a lot. But then actually you can still write it in the way they suggest, and then it could still seem wrong as well. So it's not these things aren't simply solved, I don't think.
I, from my experience, I mean, I think this is a battle you will never win. You can never write about a woman well as a man. You know, there's always, you're going to get something wrong, some detail that will be off. So, but well, you have a book to write or a story to write, you have to write it. But I've never had the pleasure of writing about periods. So.
I definitely agree with Giles. You know, like I have been fortunate in several ways in that whenever I've written about women, my editors, my publishing houses have been women, so that helps a lot. They will read it and they'll be like, no. I say, okay, sorry. You know, I also pass it with my wife. Is always my first reader. So whenever I write something, I give it to my wife, particularly if there's an area. Just everything I write, but particularly, and then she would look at it, and she's very constructive. She's a lawyer, so she has a very constructive, so she'll say, no. So that helps a lot. But actually, my next book that's coming out is narrated from the point of view of a woman who starts when she's 15 until she's about 25. So that has been really interesting for me to do because I have two daughters now. So I also look at them, and when I'm writing, I'm thinking in that mindset. But it's very hard to remove yourself from your masculine mind completely. It is absolutely difficult. You realize that you have certain sentiments that you didn't know you have until you look at what you've written. You realize that that's what a man would think about a woman, not how a woman would think about it. So it's constantly learning. I would say the process always teaches me more about women, which is a lifelong learning. So yes. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Edwin. I wanted to ask because majority of I guess when I saw the panel and I saw the topic, I was really interested because majority of what I write as a writer usually revolves around women. And when I read a lot of male writers, I find that even more important than writing correctly about women, there's always a sense of detachment when they write male characters. Male characters in a lot of their work do not have that duality of masculinity and femininity, which is something that Ishmael was talking about how he has to like detach himself from his masculine mind. So I feel I've always wondered how you can properly write about women when even the male characters that a lot of writers who like write about women, their male characters are basically a counterpoint to what they consider femininity. So the characters do not have the nuance and duality of having a feminine side, or I wouldn't want to even call it a feminine side because I feel like everybody has that duality, and that duality really doesn't, like, it feels like the characters, the female characters in this book, even when they are nuanced, they're there to provide guidance and they are not really allowed to be like selfish or mean or unlikable. They have to, even when they're difficult women, they still have to, round back and provide some kind of satisfactory ending, because the male character needs to learn from them. The male character needs them to provide his humanity. So how does a writer like transcend that?
Well, except your chief.
Yes, I mean, for me, I think in all my works that I've written, I don't like likable characters to start with, because I think it's too boring. I think every human being has duality, right? You're good to some people you're nasty to them, you have bad days, good days. So I never have characters that are just a little nice, because I find it boring to start with. And I never have good, nice endings. I don't like to wrap it up in a bow and go prancing in the sunlight, because I don't think that's how life is. Every day there's a different difficulty you have to face, so I never end. And in my novel, there's actually a lot of women who are not good, and some who are bad, and some who are good at times, and some who are not bad, but they're just allowed to be themselves, and they are unapologetic for it. For example, the chief in my book is one of the chief in the town who allows the mining company to come. Is a woman chief, so it's not a man. And she's loved by people, but she also has this very corrupt side, and she does these things, and she deceives her people. So I never have, because I think it's just boring, plain and simple. It doesn't make for complicated, interesting character development. To have somebody that's well-rounded, When I give something to people to write, I always tell them, is this character likable? Do you like them? Or are there things about them that you really dislike? And I want to build on either aspect equally.
I think that to suggest there's a way to write about the female character is to toe the line of stereotypes, because we think that women will cry and men will not cry or whatever. So I think that would be also falling into a trap. But for about 9 years of my life, I wrote for a magazine that catered to women's issues. And I wrote as a woman, they were mostly biographical stories, and I wrote like I was writing from a woman's point of view. And every time my book comes out, people like give me a hard time, like, oh, you treat women badly, you don't present them well. One of them is here looking at me. But I think that the time I actually got like a pass mark for this was when I sent in my last book to the publishers, and it gave it to 3 assessors who were all women. And they all came back with their reports, and they said, her book, she writes, nobody thought I was a man. So I think, I'm qualified. Thank you.
Well, I think I probably still remain unqualified, Toni, but I might take some lessons from you about how, but I think I appreciate your question, Edwin, but I think that these qualities or definitions that you refer to are not sort of static in the first place. And it's a complicated issue, I think. But in terms of how they manifest in a novel, I think it's really important to remember that it's not static in the novel either. It's that Ishmael talked about character development, and that is something that happens over time in a novel. In the same ways that as when you first meet someone, you make a kind of snap judgment, and then if you get to know them for longer and longer, you see other sides of their character. So in some ways, the same sort of thing is happening when we approach a character in a novel, and we're turning over page by page and getting to know them more. So you could argue that with gender questions, as well as lots of other things, characterization is sort of the reversal of the obvious, and we want to avoid the obvious. There we go.
All right. Right. Thank you very much. I should like to end with a paraphrasing of this. With that, I think we should close the discussion on these books, which are available for sale. Thank you very much, Ishmael, Toni, and Giles. Thank you very much. You've been a wonderful audience.